again, it's so much of the trouble is what not to talk about, because you feel bad about leaving stuff out. And you can't talk about quite everything. Even we were looking at it last week, because this week starts right at the end of the plagues. And so we've had 7 already, and we've got 3 left. And so it's just one of those moments. We remember from last week, God was making a statement about all the things that He was doing, about all the judgments that was going on. He wanted to make sure that there was no question that there is no one like Him, that He has no rivals, that there is no one equal to Him. And that still continues somewhat this week. That is not lost on what's happening next, because things just do continue to escalate. But focusing a little bit differently here, there are certain things that He asks of His people that doesn't always make sense to people like Pharaoh, right? They don't make sense to the Pharaoh, they don't make sense to the world, they don't make sense to the system that exists, that we live in. And so to them, the way of God, the halakha of God is foolishness. It's burdensome, it's bondage. That's the kind of language that we've heard, that we might have grown up with and been taught. But God does not see things in His way of life and what He calls us to. He does not see the things the same way. What we really need is to be freed from Pharaoh and his control. We need to be freed from the world system and its interference with God's way of life for His people. And that's really one of the primary purposes for Passover. That's one of the main reasons that Passover takes place and occurs. God commands that the Israelites go out and serve or worship Adonai. In order for them to accomplish this task, Pharaoh must let his people go. That's what this first passage is. So Moses and Aaron, can y'all read this okay? Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, "This is what Adonai, the God of the Hebrews, says. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go so they may serve me." So they've already experienced these 7 plagues already. But pay attention. Notice what he says. What makes Pharaoh, what makes essentially, by contrast, the world, what makes Pharaoh interfere with the people of God from following him fully? You see what it is? How long will you refuse to humble yourself? What do we call that when you refuse to humble yourself? We call that pride. Isn't pride, that's the bottom line, one of the biggest issues that we have. That we refuse to humble ourselves before God. We don't want to. We don't like to. We think we want to be the top dog. We always want to be the one in charge. We don't want to humble ourselves before anybody, because we think that's a sign of weakness. We've been taught that. And yet, to humble yourself, to put your life in the hands of another, especially of the one that is greater, that is the essence of coming to know the Lord. Pharaoh and the world system does not want to be submitted to God. Why don't people come into the light? Because men loved what more than the light? They love the darkness more than they love the light. They prefer that way of life. And because they do not want to be submitted to God, they will try to prevent God's people from submitting to Him as well. How long will you humble yourselves before me? Let my people go. It's because he's refusing to humble himself, because the world refuses to humble itself, that they interfere with these things. Since Pharaoh, since we don't want to go, then we're going to stop you from going too. But the Father warns him that kind of interference with the worship of God, interference with the people of God, following him and following his ways, that comes with consequences. There's an or else in verse 4. And that's a significant thing. And when you read that section, just the warning about the locusts was enough to get the servants of Pharaoh to speak up to try to put an end to it. They had already seen these 7 judgments go against them. They had tried it. They tried to match it for a little while, but they couldn't do it. And they couldn't stand before Moses. They had seen enough. And so though at this point, it had not made them more humble. It actually made them more angry. Look at verse 7. Pharaoh's servant said to him, "How long will this man, be a snare to us? Send the men so they may serve Adonai their God. Don't you realize yet that Egypt is being destroyed?" Can you hear the bitterness in what they're saying? The anger in what they're seeing? Can you see the focus of what their anger is? Yeah, they're focusing it on that man. They're focusing it on those people. Right? They are blaming the Jews for the situation. These people are a snare to us. The Jews, according to Egypt, and the Jews, according to the world system, they are the ones to blame for all of their problems. Can't you see that Egypt is being destroyed? All of Pharaoh's problems, all the world's problems are being placed on the Jews. Doesn't that sound familiar? We've heard that kind of stuff recently, within the last 100 years or so. We hear it on the news, even within the last week. We've heard Hitler do that. We've seen the increase in our own time. And we've got to understand that this is going to be a defining issue in the world that is coming, about what's going to happen, what's your relationship, what's your connection to the Jewish people. It's going to be a defining issue for the Christian world. Those who side with the Jewish people and those who side against them. And there are going to be churches and Christians and people on both sides of that. And sadly, there's probably going to be a majority on the against side when it all boils down. Once everything starts to happen, more and more are probably going to turn against them. But notice, when you see this, notice that in blaming them, in blaming Moses, in blaming these people, they're still trying to control them. Because what does it say? Send the men, right? Send them out. They try to set the rules. They try to control the boundaries of who can and who can't, when they can go and when they can't, what they can do and what they can't do. They want to try to make it as hard as possible to do what they really want to do, and they want to make it as easy as possible for them to continue in the life that they already know and experience there in Egypt. Egypt, they want to keep them there. Give them a little bit of what they want, but make sure that they have to come back to us, come back to our system, come back to the slavery that they know. Don't let them go too far. Put some restrictions. Still try to be in control. Isn't that how the world system works when it comes to the people of God? Because we've got to realize that the world system does not really like you as the person of God, does not really love you. It only wants what it can get out of you and from you, just like Pharaoh wanted to get from them. Pharaoh didn't love the Israelites, he feared them. He exploited their labor, their ingenuity, so Pharaoh and Egypt could prosper. He tolerated their existence, but he actually loathed them. We talk about this today. You've heard about this even in the attitude of politicians toward the common man. This has been in the news in the last week between the elites and the deplorables, those people with their lines on their maps and their reading and stuff. Y'all see that clip? That was hilarious. It was sad, but it was so revealing of what they really think. But this is a good example of the difference between tolerance and freedom. And liberty and those types of things when it comes to society, when it comes to things like government. Governments that tolerate religious freedoms. They allow their children, their citizens, to do certain things. But the moment that it goes too far, the moment they actually don't like it, or they say something that they don't like, then they'll have the power to put a stop to it. That's tolerance. You can believe what you want in your own building, in your own little meeting place, but don't take it out into the public, out into the rest of society. But see, notice where, when you're talking about tolerance, where the power still lies. It's in the government that allows. You know, the government that tolerates you and your presence and your practice. Tolerance still requires you to work within their system and gain their approval. You know, as long as we approve, you can do it, you can say it, you can believe it. We will, but otherwise, if it's not, then we will make you conform. We will punish you if you go outside of the lines. Aren't we seeing that happen in our day more and more? You know, far too many politicians and even citizens in the country today believe in religious tolerance and not in religious freedom and liberty. You know, that's sadly, it's the workplace isn't much different anymore. You know, the workplace, they tolerate or accommodate some religious expression and practice, but that it better not affect your willingness to do overtime, right? Sure, we recognize religious holidays, but it's the ones that we want, not necessarily the ones that you want, right? And if you do want to take off those days, well, that comes on your own, right? But religious liberty is different. Religious liberty is not dependent on the government allowing you to live by your conscience and by your conviction. Religious liberty is yours first. You know, a government that believes and practices religious liberty is supposed to set up a system that allows you to believe and practice without the interference or permission from that government. So, sure, you might be in the minority of a larger culture, but you can still practice your faith. This is not a new debate by any stretch of the means, especially in this country. Got a couple of things here with religious tolerance versus freedom. On May 6, 1776, so this is before the actual Declaration of Independence, it says 32 sons of Virginia, representing every county in the state, met in Williamsburg to pass a resolution calling for the Virginia delegates at the Continental Congress to move for independence from Great Britain. This Virginia Convention was also tasked with drafting a Bill of Rights and a Constitution for the now independent state of Virginia. At the age of 51, the elder statesman George Mason of Gunston Hall emerged from retirement to, wouldn't it be nice to retire at 51, to represent Fairfax County and agreed to write the first draft of both the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Virginia Constitution. The Declaration of Rights was read to the entire convention on May 27, 1776. In section 16, on religion, Mason, following the thinking of the era, wrote that governments must uphold toleration in the exercise of religion. So religious tolerance was understood as permission given by the state to individuals and groups to practice religion. However, there was a 25-year-old guy named James Madison who objected to Mason's toleration clause and successfully led this effort to modify the original language. He says, Madison argued that religious liberty, religious tolerance, this is that definition, permission given by the state to an individual and groups to practice their religion. He argued to change this to that religious liberty was a natural and an inalienable right. It cannot be separated from you. It was possessed equally by all citizens and had to be beyond the reach of the civil magistrates. The problem with religious tolerance, he argued, is that what the state gave, it could also take back. Madison changed Mason's toleration in the exercise of religion to the free exercise of religion. And this revised Declaration of Rights was passed unanimously on June 12th of 1776. So he said religious liberty was this natural and inalienable right, possessed equally by all citizens beyond the reach of civil magistrates. Because again, what the state gave, he could also take back. So he changed that language. And so, of course, this had some influence. You look at one of his quotes. Madison was saying, "The religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate." Does that sound good? Well, I saw an article this morning from Attorney General William Barr. He had a couple of quotes where he says, today, he's being interviewed and such, says, "Today religion is being driven out of the marketplace of ideas, out of the public awareness and sphere." He says, "There's an organized, militant, secular effort to drive religion out of our lives." He says, "The problem today is not that religious people are trying to impose their views on non-religious people. It's the opposite. It's that militant secularists are trying to impose their values on religious people, and they're not accommodating the freedom of religion of people of faith." Are y'all seeing that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And what's always been a challenge for me, when you read the text of the First Amendment, when I was, this was weird for me, when you're growing up in high school and going through your civics or government class, I always had a hard time understanding this one. Not that it doesn't read well, but I could never figure out why they put so many topics in number 1. Anybody else have that problem? It's like, okay, could they not pick number 1, so they did 1A, 1B, 1C, and all that other kind of stuff? You've got the respecting the establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, freedom of speech, you've got of the press, the right of the peoples to peaceably assemble, to petition the government for a redress of grievances. All those types of things. And it took me a long time to figure out why, because the way we understand these phrases and teach them and talk about them and use them in court cases in law is that this is an issue. This freedom of speech is a separate issue. Freedom of the press, what's that talking about? That's talking about like the media and newspapers and TV and reporters and all that. A right of the people to assemble, that's talking about protests and all that kind of stuff. And petitioning the government, we kind of ignore that one anyway. But we teach them as if they are all separate issues. And they're not. They're not separate issues at all. All of the semicolon gave it away right there. Everything else is all of this. This is the first issue, number 1. Establishment of religion. That's talking about a state or federal church, federal official recognition that gets tax money to support it and all that other kind of stuff. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. All right? So federal government is not supposed to be in the church business, so to speak, and it's not supposed to be stopping it. Everything else that follows are examples of how government has done it. Abridging the freedom of speech.
Prayer in schools.
Prayer in schools. Well, prayer, but you had to, back in the day, you had to go and get permission or get a license from the state or from the local government in order to preach a message or a sermon in public. And if you weren't a part of the established state church, then they could deny you your license to preach and therefore be arrested if you do it. Press is not just talking about although it's including, it's not just talking about the agency of reporters and newspapers. It's actually talking about the printing press. And so, because of the establishment of religion, if there was an official state church, but you were printing out flyers and of your sermons or of your ideas of maybe say of believers' baptism, and that went against the established religion, and you were using those and distributing those out, guess what? You can get arrested for that. You could have everything confiscated. You could be fined for printing out and distributing your ideas. The right of the people to peaceably assemble. What does that sound like? If you're talking about in the context of religious expression,
Having to have an underground church or something.
doing this,
Yeah.
meeting together as a congregation, as a group of people to study the scriptures and maybe hear somebody that doesn't belong to that, guess what? You could be arrested for it. And then the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Like I said, we typically ignore that one, but what that means is only people who were approved and a member of the established church had a right to go and speak to and say, hey, I've got a problem. If you weren't a member of that, then you have no basis of bringing an issue. Every one of these is about religion. But that's not how we teach or understand it in civics today. So this is what religious liberty is supposed to look like. Sorry, that's just a little extra 50 cents, so to speak, of a pet peeve of mine. But one thing that came out of this era, this is a quote from George Whitefield, which I thought was interesting. It says that all politics formed against Christ and his gospel end at last in the destruction of those who contrived them. Okay, well, what are we talking about in this passage? Doesn't this not sound like what happened to Egypt? It sounds a lot like what happened to Egypt. All right, Egypt opposed the gospel, the redemptive plan of God, the redemption of God's people and the establishment of his kingdom, and so Egypt is destroyed. Getting back to this here in Exodus chapter 10, the Israelites are still, they're trapped, they're stuck in this system of Egypt and under the thumb of Pharaoh. He and his servants, they hate them, blame them, seek to control them. They offered this compromise of, well, why don't you just send the men? And so Moses responds in verse 8. Moses and Aaron were brought to Pharaoh again. Go, he says, go, serve Adonai your God, but here's the conditions, here's the restrictions. Who's going to be going? Remember, he'd been told to send only the men. Moses answered, well, we'll go with our young and our elderly, our sons and our daughters. We'll go with our flocks and our herds, for we must have Adonai's feast for him. Everybody's got to go. Everything we have has got to go, and it must be available for Adonai if he asks for it. Men, women, and children, young and old, every generation has got to participate in the blessing of worshiping God. So no person in our family, no item in our possession is to be left out from the call of God to go. And that's what even this Torah portion is called, right? So to leave Pharaoh, to leave the world system, to worship and serve the King of the universe, that's what he's asking. That's what they're trying to get this thing to happen. We must, and in order to do that, he says, we must have Adonai's feast for him. We must keep, or celebrate Adonai's feast. This is not supposed to be an option. This is a must. Right? We must do it because God commands it. We must do it whether Pharaoh in Egypt like it or not. Whether the world and its system recognizes it or not. Whether it gains approval of or not. Because this is what God has asked them to do. This is what God has asked his people to do. And I would hope we would think that we are his people. And that he makes similar demands of us. And, there's a similar moment in Acts chapter 4 when Peter and John are arrested for preaching in the name of Jesus, and they're told by the council, by the leadership, to say, hey, you guys need to stop doing that. You need to stop preaching in this name Yeshua, right? What do they say? They called them in. They ordered them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Yeshua, But Peter and John replied, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you decide. This should not be a very difficult thing to figure out, of whether we should obey God or obey men. He says, for we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and what we have heard. That's a powerful moment. And we look to that. And when you look at the word chag, or feast, it's talking about that feast or a festival. What's interesting about it is it comes from another word, chagag, which means to observe a festival. But it also means to march in a sacred procession. And this gets really interesting at this point. It also means to move in a circle, or even a repeating cycle type of thing. So it's a regular type of thing, but moving in a circle, how does that play in? Because it also means to celebrate or dance. And most of the Jewish or Hebraic dance is what? It's circular. So even the keeping of the feast, the repetitive cycle, the repeating of this thing, and the element of dance is all a part of these things. And this tells me that, that we must celebrate this feast. We must celebrate a feast to the Lord and such. This tells me that at least at this moment, but their leaving was already planned and set up so that the Israelites would have their leaving would correspond to a feast day. They're wanting to go out into the wilderness to celebrate a feast. And so that makes me wonder, if they had left this at this moment, which feast would they be going out at? The plague of locusts and the darkness it must be occurring just before one of the feasts. We talk about which one. And the issue is more likely is Shavuot. It's the likely one, as the previous plague or hail destroyed the flax and the barley. Because the barley was in the ear, but the flax was in bloom. So it hadn't happened yet. The wheat and the spelt were not destroyed because they ripened later. And presumably, that's what these things, the wheat and the spelt, is what the locusts consumed. And that's implied in verse 4 and 5. Back in that warning, that or else that he gave. Or else, if you refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow I will bring locusts into your borders. Then they will cover the face of the earth so that no one will be able to see the ground. They will eat the remainder of what escaped, whatever is left from the hail. Which is, again, that happened around the time of Passover and shortly thereafter with that barley harvest. And eat every tree that grows for you out in the field. And so this was probably around that time. But Moses, he had stated that everybody must go. Every generation must leave Egypt and its ways and go so they can live and worship according to his halakha, his way. But notice, again, how Pharaoh, how Egypt, how the world reacts to this desire to live according to their conscience. You see it in chapter 10, verse 10. But Pharaoh, he said to them, so may Adonai be with you, if I ever do let you go. With your little ones, see clearly now, evil is in your face. Not so. Go now the men, just the men, and serve Adonai, for that's what you were seeking. Then they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. Again, Pharaoh he's trying to impose conditions. He's trying to impose limitations. He's trying to maintain some kind of control on the Israelites worshiping God, saying who can go, where they can go, when they can go, what they can do. He'd done that previously back in chapter 8. Verse 21, he said, go and sacrifice to your God, but you're supposed to stay where? Stay in the land. Right? Does the same thing in verse 24. Okay, you can go out further, but you can't go very far away. And he's constantly trying to put these limits on them. What Pharaoh was offering, this compromise, is the illusion that I think a lot of us may know about if you have a dog. Anybody have dogs? Anybody have a leash? What does a leash do? I especially like one of these because it's that retractable that can go in and out and extend a whole lot farther. You know, it actually, it for the dog, it sure feels like, man, I'm free, I'm out on my own, I can go as far as I want to, right? Not quite. It feels like you can go where you want, when you want, as far as you want. But at some point, what's going to happen? It's going to pull you back. The same thing, you know, with a big yard that a dog is let out to. At some point, you come across, most people will have a fence, right? But it doesn't matter how pretty the fence is. It's still a fence. It's going to stop you. And it doesn't matter how pretty it is. It's still going to set the limits. It's still going to restrict your freedom. But you know what the most dangerous kind of fence is? It's the invisible fence. The fence that you can't even see. That, you know, you've got these nice little flags there, but most of the time you don't even have those anymore, because at some point the dog learns you don't go there. Because how the collar and how the training and the thing works is that it'll stop. The dog will stop itself with just a few reminders, and then, like most situations, eventually you could turn the system off and he'll still stay within the boundary because of his training. But the kind of fence that you don't even recognize or see, that keeps you contained and you don't even know it. And that's really how so many of us grew up when it comes to obeying God. You know, all of the centuries that we've been taught and accepted, you know, ideas and teachings about Torah regarding the feast, the Sabbath, the food, and all that stuff that has helped us feel good about ignoring God's commands. Those are like the invisible fence that made us read and interpret the Scripture in a certain way. And these are no different than Pharaoh's efforts to keep Israel in Egypt, or to keep them coming back on a leash or staying within the boundaries of the land, so to speak. And this system, this arrangement is no different really than what the Antichrist wants to set up to keep the people of God enslaved. We've talked about this maybe before. Daniel chapter 7, talking about this rise of this leader, is that he will speak words against the Most High and will continually harass the Kedoshim, the saints, the holy ones of the Most High, and will try to change the appointed times and the law, the feast, the Moed, and the Torah. Because the Antichrist does not want us to worship God in spirit and in truth. He does not want us to keep the feast. He does not want us to observe the Sabbath or keep the Torah. Y'all realize that, right? That's how most of us have grown up, without any of those things. Doing this, living with this, is a form of harassment. You know, harassment's a big issue in today's world. Oh, I feel harassed. Well, the Antichrist, the enemy, is doing this to harass the people of God, the holy ones of God. It's also translated as oppression or affliction, and it's talking about affliction in a mental sense. It's not even just a physical thing, it's a mental kind of affliction, which means to wear you down. To wear you down to the point that you don't have the will, you don't have the energy, you don't to fight back or think that there's any way to live a different way, or that there's any way of escape, or that there's some other type that is trying to wear you down, to wear the people of God to think that you can't escape, you can't get out, you have no options, you must live as you are told, to keep you inside the invisible fence that Satan has put up for us, so that we don't truly follow and live for God. Same thing. Remember, as we were reading at the beginning of the service, the Sabbath is a sign or a mark for God's people, as are all of the feasts. They set apart the people of God from the rest of the world. Those are supposed to be a sign that lasts how long? For they're supposed to be eternal. They're not ever supposed to come to an end in this world. They set us apart. And so by rejecting the Sabbath, right, by rejecting the feasts, we are refusing to bear the sign or bear the mark of God. And so instead, if we don't bear God's mark, whose mark are we going to bear? We're going to bear the enemies. We're going to bear that what we call the mark of the beast later. We will be living in his system by the enemy's appointed times, by the Antichrist laws or rules, and we won't even realize it. It'll be a fence and a barrier that we can't even see, but we've become so comfortable with that we just accept it. And we've been worn down to the point that we don't think there's another way. The Antichrist will outlaw or ban these things, the feasts, the Sabbath and such, as he did previously in the days leading up to the events of Hanukkah, which we've talked about, or that the early church did away, pulling away from the Jewish foundation of the faith. It's not just saying, okay, do this. It's now you can't do that anymore. See, Satan's strategy has not changed since Pharaoh. And really, it was even before him. He will continue to try to enslave God's people until he is convinced otherwise. And Pharaoh must be convinced. He must be pushed to let the people of God go, and that takes place in the plagues and the judgments of God upon him. It's so that Pharaoh may know. But you know what's strange? It's believed that even after all of these plagues, not even all the Israelites left. Some of them stayed in Egypt. And the same thing happened at the time of the exile. They had been driven out from the land, but when Cyrus gave them permission to go home, most of the Jews stayed in Babylon or in Persia. They were comfortable where they were at. They didn't feel the need to break out of that prison that they were really in to go back to worshiping God. And when that happens, it's not Pharaoh that has to change. It's not the world that has to change. It's who? It's the Israelites. It's the people of God. So it's the people of God who have to change in order to follow God's command to go. Both Pharaoh and the Israelites need convincing. And that goes back to verse 1. Then Adonai said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, because I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, so that I might show these my signs in their midst, and so that you may tell your sons and your grandchildren what I have done in Egypt, as well as my signs that I did among them, so you may know that I am Adonai." So Pharaoh in Egypt needs to know that he is the Lord. Israel, God's people, needs to know and experiencing him in that way as well, to be reminded. God's people then and now must have their eyes opened to see and hear the call of God that he wants us, because he wants us to heed that call, to leave, to go and live in freedom. To ignore the leash, to ignore the fence of bad theology that keeps us enslaved, and return to the Lord and his ways. And I want you to understand, don't think of this as a sense of bashing Christianity or bashing the church, because for too long we have been worn down, because we don't understand the freedom of God's Torah and his ways. And think about it like this. Most of y'all see the news, y'all hear all sorts of stories about the abuse of children and things like that. Y'all have heard those things, right? When there is an abusive father, does anyone blame the child for saying that they love their dad and want to go back to live at home with him? If he's an abusive father, do you blame the kid for saying, "I want to go back home"? No. You don't blame the kid for that.
understand.
The kid doesn't understand. The kid doesn't understand that it's not supposed to be that way. That there is another way that you're supposed to live. That's all they know. You don't blame the kid for that. But you do still try to rescue them from it. Right? We are blinded. We are enslaved. We are abused by a very cunning enemy that has convinced us that we belong to him. And that's why we need to be rescued. That's why we need the Messiah. That's why, as Paul talks about in Colossians, we give thanks to the Father who qualified you to share in the inheritance of the Kedoshim, of the saints in the light. That's what's available to us, but we don't really know it. We don't recognize it. So we need this. He rescued us from the domain of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son whom he loves, because it's in him that we have redemption, the release of our sins. That's what we need. That's the purpose of the Passover, to deliver us out of that. See, Egypt thought of itself as the light. Egypt thought itself as the beacon of civilization. It thought it ruled the world. Those pyramids that we see today are not like what they built back then. All of the surface stones have been removed. Those things, when they were built, were like a blazing white, that the sun would shine down on them and they would be blinding. They're not like that today. But these blazing white pyramids would reflect the power of their sun god. What's his name? Ra, right? But it was not the paradise that God wanted for his people. Egypt was not the light. It was, in fact, the light was an illusion. Everything was darkness and slavery. In spite of all of its abundance, in spite of all of its riches, it was still a place of darkness and slavery. Which is why even Ra is a target of the judgment of God. That's why he was the target of the 9th plague. We talked about this a bit last night, and maybe some of y'all know some things that we can share afterward. But trying to figure out that when we were looking at this passage in chapter 10, he goes from the locusts, and those all blow through the city, or through the nation. And then when you get to verse 21, right after Adonai hardened Pharaoh's heart, then Adonai said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward heaven, and there will be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness that may be felt." There's no conversation between Moses and Pharaoh. And we were talking about that last night in a sense. Why is that? Most of the time, when something's about to happen, Moses goes in before Pharaoh, gives him a chance to say, "Hey, here, let my people go. And if you don't, this is what's going to happen." Nothing like that. It goes from one straight into the next. From the locust to the plague of darkness. But we notice, look back in verse 15. It says, "They covered the face of the whole earth, so that the land itself was darkened. They ate every plant in the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. No green thing remained, nor tree or plant in the field." So the land itself, some of y'all might even say the land was blackened. Right, y'all see that? So the locusts turned the land black with their numbers, and then the 9th plague does what? It darkens the sky itself. It darkens blocks out the sun for 3 days. So both earth and heaven were affected. It's a darkness that, it says, could be felt, to the point that not even the fire or the torches or the lamps could light the homes of the Egyptians. Now the Israelites could have light in their home, but their fire was not even enough. But I think the key to understanding why there's no conversation, why there's no break, or why there's no separation or conversation between Moses and Pharaoh comes in verse 10. He said to them, "So may Adonai be with you if I ever do let you go with your little ones. See clearly now, evil is in your face. What's interesting is that word in your face is panaim. It means, face, but it also means presence or person, where it's used with different types of notations. It can be before, toward, or in front of, or in the presence of. All right? Y'all with me so far? Then you look at the word that it uses for the evil. It talks about to see or to look at, but at the heart of that one is the word ra, which means bad or evil. All right? Evil is in your face, is how it's translated, at least by the TLV and such. But I think it's, in a lot of ways, it's a play on words. I don't think Pharaoh would have been speaking in Hebrew, right? And remember that Moses, he's already announced the coming of the locust. And so I believe Pharaoh, after seeing so many of the other Egyptian deities, the lesser deities, defeated and fall, he is now calling upon Ra for protection. Ra is before you. Ra is there for you. So as the time, think about it like this, that as the time of the enemy draws near to its end, right, does he lessen his attacks or increase them? He increases them, right? He knows that his time is short, so he gets even more violent and more desperate. And so I believe that Pharaoh, he's like, okay, I'm done playing around with you now. I'm done letting all the little guys handle things. I'm calling out the big guns. I'm calling on Ra to do the fighting for him, to end this insignificant Hebrew rebellion. But Ra, the brightness of the sun cannot stop the earth from being darkened with the locust, and neither can Ra prevent his own light from being snuffed out. Because Egypt, despite all of its beauty and all of its glory, had no light. It had no spiritual light, no blessing. This plague of darkness proved just how much in darkness everybody in Egypt was. And that's also parallels how much really the world system is in darkness. Despite all of even America's abundance, even as great as our economy is doing, spiritually there's a lot of darkness here, isn't there? Even here among us. And this darkness leads only to death. And the only way to be saved from this darkness is to be redeemed. To accept the offering of the Lamb. That's the purpose of the Passover. The only way to escape from Egypt, whether you're an Israelite or whether you're one of the mixed multitude, is to heed the call of God to go and answer His call, to go and worship Him. Even as a Gentile, to cleave yourself to Israel, to go out with them. And the world is going to fight back against that. The world is going to resist that. The world system is going to make this hard to follow God and hard to follow His ways. But it is necessary to be brought into the kingdom of the Son. And so, may we all continue our journey out of Egypt. We have to talk about it as if we were ones that left Egypt too. That's what we talk about and say when we go through the Seder. We all continue our journey out of Egypt and to the mountain, to the kingdom of the Son, the Mashiach, the Messiah. That's what we all need. And it's going to be a fight to do it.